Welcome back to Stumbling Through Security with your host, Sean Goodwin, for episode 003. I'm joined by my colleague, Tim, today. We actually recently both were able to attend DerbyCon 9, the final year of the DerbyCon conference. And we wanted to get together and talk through some of the biggest highlights for us going through the conference. There were 3 different main tracks along with a set of stable talks, shorter, essentially half-length sessions. So the schedule was really packed. We were kind of all over the place during the conference. So really what we want to do is be able to highlight some of the biggest takeaways from the sessions we went to and try and focus your efforts if you're able to go back and watch some of these talks. Before we jump into that, Tim, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure thing. My name's Tim. As Sean said, we're colleagues. I currently right now work in the healthcare vertical. I've been in the information security world for about 2 to 3 years now. I've been in the technology industry in some facet or another since in my mid-20s. And by background, I'm a systems administrator, but currently now I'm an analyst.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's just jump right into it. Right off the bat, if you had to pick one talk for someone to go and watch the recording of, what would that be?
Off the top of my head, I would do Assumed Breach, a better model for penetration testing with Mike Saunders. He works over at Red Siege as someone that's more internal, more I hazard to use the term blue team. As someone who's more internal security analyst, it was really good to get an idea of exactly what the penetration tester's methodology and mindset's going to be. But Mike went into a lot of detail on a bunch of tools that your side of the house is really familiar with, that I only know by name or just in passing. But that talk is specifically turned into additional workflows at my organization that I specifically am going to be using to basically demonstrate in my environment to find weaknesses and to affect change.
Awesome. So you got takeaways right off the bat.
Yeah.
Before a pen test comes in, you can actually start to clear some of the low-hanging fruit.
Absolutely. My whole approach to security has always been, how can I push the bar just a little bit higher? Can I make my attacker's job just a little bit harder so maybe they go find somebody else?
Yeah, find someone else, or that's one more tripping point where you might be able to detect something.
Sure.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I was able to attend that one as well, and I think it is a good model. I think one of the points they had was setting some of those expectations. What you don't want to do is, engage someone for a pen test and waste the entire, funding at one stage of, the attack chain or the attack path. You want to be able to move throughout and really get the most value out of that tester's time.
Yeah, there were a couple of talks that had kind of that theme of what do we do as pen testers and what do we do as red team attackers. And it was, we always, try to provide, or the red team side of the house always kind of tries to provide fixes and repairs to things, configuration changes, but also to not just sit there and, pay a company like CrowdStrike or someone to come in and just fish your network for 2.5 weeks and then be like, yep, didn't find anything. Because they were just spending their time trying to get in versus assuming that model where they get a footprint and they can actually go and do things. So right. Really, really good chunk of talks touched on that.
Awesome. Yeah. So semi-related to that, and kind of blending getting the most value, was there actually a few talks around using the tool Bloodhound, both as an offensive weapon, but also gearing some of the talks around internal usage and really just monitoring for weak or really just outright bad Active Directory configurations. I don't know if you're able to see any of those, but I know there was one of them that I sat in on, Bloodhound from red to blue, that was really showing kind of the evolution of, hey, this tool was released for really pen test usage and being able to identify the fastest way to get from a low privileged user to a domain admin or similar elevated rights user.
Yeah, the whole convention really had just a lot of good Bloodhound content. I think there was a Bloodhound talk pretty much every day, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, if I remember correctly. Um, the So they had the two of the guys that created part that in part created Bloodhound, I should say, Andy Robbins and Rowan Vazrak. They had that's actually a talk that I sat in. That was really good. It basically gave the whole history and a brief demonstration of Bloodhound, kind of A to Z. That was a really insightful, really useful tool. That's actually the first thing that I intended to do when I got back this week. Unfortunately, getting caught up on emails and all that other good stuff that always comes with a few days off has gotten in the way. But that's definitely one of the takeaways that I'm going to be running.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's a good point. I should give Matthew Saulnier, if I'm saying that right. Sorry, Matthew, if I'm not. But that other Bloodhound talk I was able to attend was given by him.
Yeah, and the one I was referencing was Bloodhound Head to Tail.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll link to each of these talks. Adrian Iron Geek was actually there recording everything. Definitely a shout out to Adrian. I think each talk was up probably within an hour of ending, up on his site and ready to go. So that was really awesome and great for folks that weren't able to get a ticket. Tickets did sell out in about 12 seconds this year. We happened to get lucky with that one.
Yeah, I actually had to buy. I bought a training ticket off of an individual on the Slack, and got to do a PowerShell training with Jose Arroyo and Jose Quintos. Really
nice.
good training from those guys. They made it in from Puerto Rico to do the training. It was as someone who has only done PowerShell for minor configuration changes and standing up base images, things like that. Really getting to see somebody who knows what they're doing flex the muscle with PowerShell. Really insightful. Yeah. And big shout out to Adrian for Adrian on Iron Geek too. Excellent platform that guy runs.
Yeah, awesome. One of the talks I went to that was kind of a different take from the typical, red team, blue team themed talks that a lot of the conferences have. Justin Leapline and Rick Yoakum actually put on this talk. They were doing a bit of research around trying to essentially use the Google machine learning platform to try and streamline some of the GRC work. So one of the pieces of my job, or one of the functions of my job, is in that GRC world where it's looking at different compliance frameworks, trying to map out how can someone implement controls but also document them in the way so that when their PCI auditor is on site, they can hand them the documents that person needs to see, as well as their financial auditor or any of these other control frameworks they have to follow. So these guys were actually doing some research around feeding the control language in, and they essentially have to go through and you have to tag the words, right? It's not magic. But what they did was they feed in different control descriptions and tag similar terms so they can mark, these actions are being taken against these assets and that sort of thing, and trying to identify. So the examples they were giving were the CIS controls CIS was one of the ones they looked at, but the main tagging was through NIST and PCI, since those were pretty descriptive, but also they lined up fairly well. And some of the results coming out of that, it's definitely a work in progress that they were presenting, but a really interesting idea where they were highlighting some controls that matched on those terms that weren't called out in some other control framework crosswalks. Certainly not the flashy, hey, this is a new zero-day attack or a crazy new defense technique. But I think that was a really important talk. I was happy to go to and certainly interested in following their work, because that's something I can only imagine getting worse as time goes on. It's like that XKCD comic about there's 14 frameworks, right? We need to make one framework to unify them all, and now there's 15 frameworks we have to follow. But being able to build out that algorithm to try and map things together, I think will be a worthwhile effort in the end.
Yeah. So mapping different controls from different frameworks to one another is something that we end up always doing in like these massive, massive Excel spreadsheets. So if you look at like the CIAQ and the CIAQ Lite, they've got these huge, huge lists of controls. What I've always tried to do is, and one of the things that I've been struggling with is trying to match our controls to not only those frameworks but also different attack metrics. So if you look like MITRE ATT&CK, kind of understanding not only your control obligations of the various frameworks that you work off of, but that doesn't even begin to touch the actual um, the attack surface that you have to deal with and the attack methodology you have to deal with. It's two really big jobs, and understanding exactly how those frameworks are all going to interplay off of each other by itself is kind of a pain in the butt. Um, so yeah, I really hope they figure out how to make that work. That would be fantastic. Um,
Right, because not only do you have to come up with the documentation for all those, but that's on
yeah,
top of your day job, right? So you still
yeah,
have to keep things running, but then you also have a bunch of auditors knocking on your door trying to get their job done as well.
yeah. Trying to keep just business interests and the various aspects of the business or your institution running and happy and surviving while maintaining all this documentation. If you're at all behind on it, I mean, if you're if you're in a position where you're just getting to a framework and starting to leverage it, it's a lot of work to just get caught up in a lot of cases, and you still have all these other so it's all these other business demands. So it ends up getting backlogged and just makes the problem worse. So, but yeah, I've seen the XKCD comic, and it always rings a bit true.
Right. And not to step on these guys' toes, I think what they're doing will be great because once they train the model with those keywords, it should be easier to add in additional frameworks and map those to what they have in their inventory now. But I don't know if you've seen it, but I use that spreadsheet from Audit Scripts a good amount where they've got most of the major control frameworks at least roughly linked together. They tried to map a lot of those. So that's been a good resource to date for me.
I think once they get to that point where they have a product, let's imagine that 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, whenever that is, when they have a good product that can recognize this language. I think the real advantage to it, is, and this may just be, me talking crazy. I think the real advantage to it would be something where I can take all of my internal policies and pump them into it. And then that will match my internal policies to all of these various control frameworks. So it does all the ticking and tying based on that ML.
Yeah. I mean, and that in theory could work, right? Because they're just tagging those keywords. So as that, I don't know if it's called the dictionary or what it is, building out that model.
Yeah.
But I could see that as a possibility, or also highlighting, hey, your policies, don't match any of the control descriptions. Do you need to add a bullet point or a sentence?
Or this control here matches nothing. So is it foolishness? Is it just something you're doing as part of something else and hasn't been clearly defined? So I think that would if you came to market with that product tomorrow, I'd buy it.
Hey, maybe they need your help.
Yeah,
build that out as an extension.
Yeah, I can barely program request scripts in PowerShell. I don't think we need to have me toying around with Google's machine learning framework just yet. So
yeah, unleash the end of the world.
Yeah.
Cool. So what else did you go to that you think people, if they only have a couple hours worth of time, what else should they go out and watch?
Well, if you've only got a couple of hours, let's dial this back a bit. If you have, if you're in my side of the house where you need to get buy-in of things, convince people to make changes, all that other good stuff, and you have one talk to watch, it would be, and frankly, this talk is big shout out to Heather Smith. This talk was the best talk of the con, in my opinion. It would be how to tell the C-level their baby is ugly. Heather at Litmoose goes through a litany of things of just all the dirty laundry that I'd seen over the course of her career, and about how to communicate to C-levels who may or may not be technical people. They may or may not be. You may or may not have all or some of their attentions, but basically how to put things into their frame of reference and for their frame of mind, how to speak C-level, basically, to how to explain how things are wrong to them sometimes, and how to not get disheartened for that. As someone on the defensive side of things, I've found many times in my career where I'm like, this is something we should really be doing right now. We should absolutely push for this right now. And then I give this kind of example of what could happen. Well, this could go this way or that way. But at the end of the day, I'm not making a business case scenario for the spend. I'm not making a real risk assessment for the spend. And I'm not really, putting it into their language. Heather's is actually one of the talks that I'm going to go back and rewatch. I started rewatching some of these, even as soon as I got back from DerbyCon, but I'd highlight her talk with many, many bullets, many, many asterisks, and many, many highlighted colors. It was just a really, really solid talk, and everyone should go see it. Honestly, I think that talk's good for not just people in technology, but anybody that has to make business cases to high levels.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That's probably something that's the hardest for us to get new people or new hires up to speed on, is being able to, communicate, okay, maybe you had this 5-step attack path, right? To get to, whatever sensitive data, hey, 5 different steps. And, we got to the finance department file share, right? Some people, especially technologists, can understand the bigger picture with that, but being able to communicate that to, an executive who needs to know, what's the bottom line? What's it going to cost me? How do we fix it? How likely is this? What does it mean beyond, cool, you got to a file share? What's that look like in a real attack? What's the bigger picture there? It's certainly a tough thing, especially, I guess from the stereotypical, technology people, being able to look at the business side and make that business case is a really important skill.
Yeah. It's super critical. It's really hard to walk into, someone's office and say, hey, I need $150,000 for EDR, and EDR is going to stop it's going to stop the viruses. Well, don't we have antivirus for that? Trying to make those cases. Well, it stops new threats and new things. What new things does it stop? Oh, it stops, these process levels. Okay. So if it stops process levels, how is it going to not affect our business demand? Well, it doesn't stop all process flows. It stops these process flows. So it's, it gets into this kind of situation where you're kind of begging the point, versus bringing real valuable language that they understand to their attention. And if you can actually learn to speak C-level, because it is its own language, I think that could be a game changer in a lot of organizations, and something that I personally, as a technologist, I am really bad at. I tend to just expect me to be able to make a really good use case for something and be like, okay, now let me do it. So it was eye opening for me.
Yeah, awesome. Worth the price of admission right there.
Yeah, hands down.
Cool. What else? What else did you? It's a 3-day conference for folks that don't know.
There's a couple of good stable talks that I went to when I had either free time to go through or, just wasn't really feeling the other talks that I was at. There was one by Jason Lewis, IPv6 security considerations for when just turning it off isn't good enough. He made the most compelling case I have heard for IPv6 and securing IPv6. The premise, the meat and potatoes of his talk was basically IPv6 is coming eventually. We're going to get to a point where either vendors have it and that's what they're issuing, or that's the platform they work off and we need to work with it, or we're going to end up having the demand because of some other business case needing and pushing it forward, or just in the very sense that, IPv6 is coming eventually. If we don't start learning how to operate within it, or operate within or operate with and secure IPv6, we're going to be in a world of hurt. And as again, the inside of the house kind of methodology will end up sacrificing security to satisfy a business need, when preparedness and just a get after it mentality would have served us a lot better. Really, really, really good talk that he put on. Another one was choose your own TTX, redefining incident response tabletop exercise by Jameson. I'm going to say this wrong. Apologies, Jameson. Jameson Budaki. He went through your pretty standard tabletop, how to set up a tabletop, what your real expectations should have and should be for a tabletop. So he was talking about how they spent 2 or 3 or 4 months planning a tabletop, then to execute it for a week. A lot of the trials and tribulations of going through it. But one of the really interesting things that he brought up, and this is a point that I've made in the past and other careers and other lives, that when something like this happens, it's not just your technical response to something. It's not what does your analyst do, what does your security vendor do, who do you contact, are you on the phone with all these people, when do you call the police, or when do you call the FBI, things like that. But it could be something as simple as who speaks and publishes the PR communications, who has the written statement for the news and the outlets. What happens when the 6 o'clock news shows up at your CEO's, as your CEO is walking into his car and starts asking him questions, and he sends things out of either a sense of confusion or a sense of panic, or puts you in a more a more less friendly light, I should say, a less friendly light. So it's taking the pen test, or taking the tabletops all the way to that level. So that was a really good talk. One of the talks that I want to look into that I did not get to see there was Circuit Swans. So Nicole Schwartz did "Are you ready to leverage DevSecOps?", which is the new big buzzword in the dev area. But it's one of the things that I work a lot with in my current role, is the development team who writes applications. So I'm really looking forward to that one.
Yeah, just circling back to that incident response one, 4 months planning and a week executing is way beyond what most organizations and most people do. Usually it's maybe 4 hours sitting around a table walking through how you're going to handle a phishing email.
Yeah.
Right? The same scenario over and over again. Yes, that's cool. I didn't see that one. That's definitely one that's on my list.
Yeah, and he goes into a lot of detail from the very beginning all the way out forward. And I think it's something that is good, that could be good for any organization, regardless of its intent or its use. So if you're in healthcare like I am, what happens when you have a big issue that hits the media? If you're in a financial securities company, what happens when director A, B, or C gets caught, doing insider trading or something along those lines? You can tabletop for any number of scenarios that are risk to the business or the organization. It doesn't have to be just a technical risk. So I think this is another one of those good talks that could apply to people outside of our industry.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that's actually a good point about, tabletopping, not just the technology incidents. So maybe that's something Black Hills can incorporate into their booster packs for backdoors and breaches, is a non-technical inject or threat cards. So if Black Hills is listening, they can give me credit for that. Right? I'm actually excited I was able to get a pack of that, backdoors and breaches, and started flipping through it. And I mean, honestly, even just looking at the controls cards have ideas not only for my own stuff, but working with clients. It's a good tool to even flip through and just get ideas for processes you could implement.
Yeah. I'm thinking about taking it home with me for Christmas and playing with some friends and family to, really give them an idea of what I do. Cause so often they're like, oh yeah, Tim's in security, and people think I'm just like this, black t-shirted, guy standing in front of a door. Which, no offense to those guys, I have done that in the past at a few other places in my much younger years. But trying to communicate to the friends and the family what I actually do for a living is always fun. So giving them having the opportunity to be kind of that tech evangelist, that would be really cool.
Yeah, that backfired for me. Maybe you'll have better luck, but I was describing the deck of cards to family, and it's probably my fault for leading off with it's like Dungeons and Dragons, but for computers. That was really just 2 negative points against me right off the bat. Oh well, that's all right. Cool. One of the ones I wanted to highlight was an introduction to Azure Sentinel, which I had never even heard of going into this. But Carl Hertz put on this talk, kind of giving us a tour of Azure Sentinel, which is essentially their SIM hosting through Azure. Something that was really interesting, and I think Microsoft has been doing a lot of really cool stuff in the security space over the last, year or two. It seems like they're leaps and bounds ahead of where they used to be and seem to be really forward thinking, which is great because a lot of people are moving more and more into that hosted space. There were certainly some limitations, but it's also not a full production release at this point. I think Azure actually tells you not to use it in a production environment at this point.
Yes.
But he was actually showing some of the different dashboards and some of the tuning they had available, where he was able to see a lot of really interesting stuff and some of the analytics side where Microsoft has that, lateral vision across all these different organizations where they can start to spot suspicious activity in one organization and feed that rule into everyone else. I don't know if you're able to see that one, but I thought that was a really cool talk. And, Azure Sentinel is something I'm definitely interested in following up on.
Yeah, I didn't attend that one primarily because my focuses are in a couple of other places. But I know as far as Microsoft has definitely been stepping up to the plate a lot for their cloud infrastructure. Amazon has also been kind of leading that way for having their own AWS firewalls in place to protect their Azure cloud, a whole bunch of other things like that. So it's good to see that. I think the cloud, in all honesty, those specific clouds, they've really been putting the security foot forward first in a lot of respects. So it's going to be interesting to find out. But it's interesting that we say how how much more Microsoft is doing when 2 of the other talks at the con were basically mind blowing for me. One of them was Trent Lowe. He did Attacking with Automation, how Office 365 automation provides another new risk to the cloud. He basically took advantage of improperly configured DLP suite in Office 365 and the Microsoft Flow utilities, and was able to use basically email with Flow and some embedded executables to get shells to execute on people's desktops or on their endpoints by sending them an email. They didn't have to open the email. They didn't have to click the email. They ended up actually just deleting the email was the best case scenario for him. And it was just suddenly like, oh, hey, yeah, here you go. Here's command prompt. Have fun. Wild. I have to go back and rewatch it to really understand what was going on. But if you're using Office 365 right now with that, that's probably a good one to take a look at.
Yeah, I need to rewatch that as well, but at least from my understanding, so you did need to have a set of credentials. They could be just a low privilege standard user, right? But so you need some sort of compromised credential, or you phish someone and get their set of credentials.
Gotcha.
But from there, that low privileged user can go in and set up a flow. So he would set that up. Okay, you've got a username and password. Maybe you can look through emails, maybe get to OneDrive, whatever. But then that real attack that was terrifying was he set up a flow for that user, and that's what did all the processing on the back end, which then opened up a shell as system on that person's computer. After saying that was pretty crazy.
and I should say, like, I missed the first half of it because I was at a stable talk that I wanted to see. Um, so yeah, thank you for correcting me on that point. So good to know.
Yeah,
But it was still pretty wild.
yeah, and I mean the fact that it's a low privileged user, is scary enough. And then he was also showing, you can set up some DLP rules through Flow. So initially, he was just trying to connect to different external um, interfaces or external systems that Flow will integrate with. And the DLP policies were stopping certain things at that point.
Yeah.
But then there's another task within Flow where you can just make simple HTTP requests, and that was bypassing all those DLP rules.
Yeah. So I guess the big takeaway from that one is MFA on your O365 tenant, so that even if they do pop the credential, you can at least force them through another factor.
Yeah, MFA
Everywhere.
Oh, well.
Just do it. You just bite the bullet. It's like IPv6. You're gonna need it eventually. Just do it.
Yeah.
Need it right now.
What else? Did you have any others you wanted to highlight?
No, that goes through. That's about. Those are the ones that I found particularly useful. I ran out of time for a lot of the cons. I had to take a mental break like on Sunday and just go for a walk, because it was just so much information so fast. All of the talks were fantastic. I cannot say I did not attend a bad talk, in my opinion. There were a few talks that were a little light. We won't go into those, but I think they're all worthwhile.
Yeah, I think there's one other I'd highlight as well, and I would definitely agree that the schedule was slammed.
Yeah,
but Sean Metcalf, basically anything he puts out, I end up being a huge fan of. The guy's a wizard with Active Directory. But so he put out, another Active Directory security talk on really highlighting some of these just inherently insecure configurations within Active Directory that, even a lot of these, it's beyond just the simple, make sure the users are in the right groups, but there's just a lot of trust and access delegation between, these like deeply built-in functions within Active Directory. It's crazy some of the things he was doing. The biggest shock really was on some of these domain controllers. If you can get access, so you need to have essentially privileged access at that point. But he was showing privileged access to a domain controller, and depending on how access rights are defined, it could be necessarily not complete domination of the network, but he was able to stop Active Directory services from running on that machine, and then you can directly edit the DIT. So he changed users from low privilege users, changed the group properties on that user account on that specific domain controller, and then restarted Active Directory with disabled synchronization with the other domain controllers. So now he had a persistent domain admin account on that one domain controller, which is all you really need if you're going to go after, everything else. And then what was great is by stopping Active Directory services, it stopped that audit logging and monitoring. And then by disabling the synchronization with the other domain controllers, that's not going to flag any of those other monitoring tools for additions to groups or any of that. So it's essentially a ghost domain admin unless someone looks at that specific domain controller.
Yeah. That's I'll have to pull that one up then. I didn't get to see that. I know I missed Sean's talk, but like you said, everything that he does is pretty awesome.
Cool. That's what I have. We probably gave people 2 days worth of videos to go watch. I'll certainly link to everything in the show notes, the talks we highlighted, as well as just the Iron Geek page for everything. Before we go, anything else you want to mention? Any closing thoughts?
One more shout out to Adrian Crenshaw and Iron Geek. I actually took a look at his Patreon page. He only has about, I think, 15 or 16 subscribers and only brings in about $50 a month. So subscribe to Adrian, guys. He does a lot of good for the community. In my opinion, just hosting and video recording, all of those things. So big shout out to Adrian. And I know for a fact that I've looked at his videos many times. So that'd be kind of my one closing thought.
Awesome. Well,
And of course, thanks to Dave Kennedy and the entire DerbyCon crew for many years of putting on good shows and good practice.
yeah, I'm pretty happy I was able to go to the last one. He's been talking a little bit about the DerbyCon Communities Initiative in the Slack channel. It seems like they've got a pretty good plan already developed, so I'm very interested to see where that ends up going.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for hanging out with us, Tim. I'm glad we were able to talk about this, and you gave me some homework of some talks I didn't get to see, so I appreciate that. And maybe we'll have you on here again.
Hey, man, I appreciate the time and the invite. So anything that I can do to assist, let me know.
Cool. All right. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Take care.